Hi, everybody. Welcome along to episode 114 of Percussion Discussion. As usual, I'm going to ask you to please check out all of our social media. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and of course, our world famous YouTube channel, where you can find all of our conversations, past and present, with the video to accompany them. Please subscribe if you find a second. It really helps us get the word out there. If you would rather listen on the go, then all of our conversations are available in podcast form, and these are free to download from your favorite podcast provider. If you can find a second to please rate and review, it helps, I should say. Fellow like-minded drummers find us and hopefully like us as much as you do. On to today's guest. I'm thrilled to be doing this. He is a friend of mine. We've been friends for at least 6 or 7 years since I had him up in North Wales to do a drum clinic. A remarkable drummer. He's been playing since a very, very young age. He's played for some incredible artists and played on some great albums as well. One of the latest ones is Richard Niles' latest release, Niles Smiles, which we talk about. It's a great album. As well as this, he juggles his other part of the career as an airline pilot as well. I think he actually trains pilots now. So a brilliant career. Unusual to find somebody who's climbed to the top of the tree in both areas of their career. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome the fabulous Mr. Ian Palmer. Ian, thanks so much for doing this, mate. It's really good to see you again.
Mate, it's great to see you as well. It's been a while, but I have been keeping up with these interviews that you've been doing, and you've done a few of them now, and have been a great resource. So thank you for all you're doing.
Oh, mate, it's honestly, it's been an absolute pleasure. And obviously, a lot of people have said, "Oh, you haven't interviewed Ian yet." And I said, "Well, if you remember back to those dark, gloomy well, they weren't dark and gloomy. The weather was glorious, but the COVID years, we did an awful lot together. You did your regular live stream, which was a real joy for drummers on a Friday. It was something to look forward to, wasn't it?"
Oh, thank you, mate. Yeah, it was. It was a strange time for everyone. It doesn't need me to say that, but I actually enjoyed the live streams. And I know we toyed around doing some things early on, and basically we got to the point where I was doing regular live streams. And many people now have said, "Yeah, I should do those live streams again." So that was 2 years ago now, and we were in the midst of the COVID pandemic, and we were all trying to make the best of it. I was made redundant from the flying gig, which we'll talk about later on, but also the whole music world was made redundant from the music business. So it's like, what the hell do we do? And actually, what was interesting musicians are pretty resilient people. We all looked at other ways of getting our business out there. Business for me being drumming. So the webcasts or the live streams were great, and they just sort of developed into a thing. And what was interesting was that there was a regular group of people that came along on a Friday afternoon to watch this, and it was just like in the end, it started off being, I was a bit nervous and thinking, oh, better say the right thing. In the end, it ended up just being with your mates, as if you were down the pub or something. I don't drink, but as if you're getting together with all your mates, which was
there was a real community, and it was something to look forward to. And what's nice, I've met so many of the people who watched that. They've either friend requested me on Facebook, or they've met me at like a drum show or a trade show, and it's like, oh, and then you put the name to the face, and it's amazing it's a great community, the drumming community anyway, isn't it?
No, it really is. And I remember at that time my original drum teacher in Birmingham, who I need to keep more in touch with, actually. It's just reminded me, Malcolm Garrett, who's a fantastic drummer, from my many, some of the greatest hands in the world. He's amazing, and he's the drum teacher at the Birmingham Conservatoire, the professor of percussion at the Birmingham Conservatoire. And Malcolm said to me that, oh yeah, some of my students have been watching your live stream. So why now? We have a general conversation, but you don't realize, you just get so into it that you don't realize that people are actually taking an interest. So I was really grateful that people actually kind of latched onto it and enjoyed it. And in fact, just recently, somebody shared onto my personal Facebook page one of the live streams that I think we did. And,
right.
I thought, oh, that was great. He said, I really enjoyed those times. You should think about doing the live streams again. So I thought, well, yeah, maybe I should.
It was good, and what I liked about it was the fact that it wasn't ever scripted. It was just like, well, let's see where it goes. We'll just have a chat. And
Yeah,
it was nice. It was natural and
yeah.
fun. Yeah.
I mean, I'm interested in the psychological point of view as well. And it was interesting the way, and you must have seen this with all of the interviews that you've done, the way you have a certain chemistry with certain people and it goes a certain way. And, you kind of almost have to be a chameleon, change a little bit to get this out of somebody or, either be a little bit more, quiet or sometimes a bit more energized. But to suit the occasion. So it was great, just in all the people that I interviewed there as well, and it was sort of a running joke as well. The amount of times I mentioned a certain drummer,
I've got the
Steve
pound.
Gadd. You remember?
I remember.
The Steve Gadd jar.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, why wouldn't you mention him? Let's be honest.
Oh, I really enjoyed your interview with him as well. It was fantastic.
He was cool. He was just yeah, such a nice guy, and finished off asking me about my cymbals, which I was not expecting. But there we are.
Well, I think one of the things you probably found with guess who we're talking about again? One of the things you find with the great Steve Gadd is that, which is great, so much humility. Try and get him to talk about himself. Next to impossible.
Anyway, look, what are you up to at the moment? I mean, anybody who follows your social media, you've been pretty busy. That you put some really nice clips up, and you've been a busy boy.
It's been a busy start to the year. Yeah, I've done. Actually, I've just made a list. I've made 4 recordings this year already, 4 albums, which I'm really proud of. And the one that I guess the one that I'm really proud of at the moment is an album that I've made with the fantastic composer and arranger called Richard Niles, who's based in Los Angeles. And it's an album which you can see on all the platforms, Apple Music, Spotify. It's called Niles Smiles, and it's very much Richard's work. Now, Richard, for those of you who don't know, Richard is a fantastic. First and foremost, he's an arranger, which is a very old school sort of concept where you'd arrange strings for a big string orchestra on a big pop album. And he worked on so many great pop albums, such as he did Grace Jones, Slave to the Rhythm, The Swing Out Sister, Breakout, the trumpet line in there, the brass part in there was Richard. He came up with that, so he's just a real inspiration, and and I don't think you'd mind me saying he's mildly eccentric, and the music actually is mildly eccentric, but some great musicians on the album as well. And it was a real privilege to play with actually someone who was originally one of my favorite bass players, who had worked with sort of Pat Metheny in the early days, along with the great Danny Gottlieb, and that bass player's name is Mark Egan.
Yeah.
Who toured with Gil Evans and with 2 bass players. The other bass player was Jaco Pastorius, and it was like, wow.
Yeah. 2 bass players. Wow, can you imagine? That's wow. That's some the lineup and the album. I think on the day it was released, I listened to it. Obviously, I'd seen you'd done some of the build up to it, so I've got to hear this, and it is proper. It's so good. I think Inside Story was the first track that really, from a drumming point of view,
Oh yeah,
and
yeah.
great organic drum sounds as you'd expect from yourself, and some wonderful
Well,
playing.
what I'll say with it was a bit of an Anglo-American production, and it was one of these which I guess has sort of come together over the last year, where we all record our parts individually. And Richard, the way he records the music, he'll arrange everything because he's an arranger. He'll arrange it on Logic or whatever he uses. He'll print the parts out in Sibelius. And the challenge with Richard is that when you're reading a part, you would normally have, I guess, what you would call an orchestration, which is where the part would show you what maybe the trumpet play or the brass section are playing, maybe an indication of the bass line. Richard doesn't do that. He does transcriptions. So every single drum fill is written out, everything. And I guess now I've sort of got to know his playing. But he used to live in London and had so many of the great drummers in London play. I know that, God rest his soul, the great Chris Dagley he played with Richard and was one of Richard's favourite drummers. Ian Thomas, Neil Wilkinson, worked with them, and everyone has always said Richard's music is really super challenging because it's a transcription. So basically, he'll write out every single tom fill, the groove, and he'll want the groove, not exactly, but the good thing now is you can play it and you can think, you know what, I think he's been listening to such and such, and I think this is what he wants. So you sort of get an idea. But it's fascinating the way he writes it, and there's all sorts of he likes sort of polyrhythmic things going on. I mean, he's a great Frank Zappa fan, amongst other people. So I guess there's sort of elements of that combined with a heavy dose of Steely Dan as well.
Yeah, it's not this. You know, it's not the sort of thing, you know, as you say, it's quite unusual. You'd normally get a chart with maybe you know, the hits on it or whatever, as you say, as our friends from across the pond use that term a little bit more than us, don't they? Phrase marks, I'd call it, but you know, there's no way you're blagging it when it's written out exactly as he wants.
You can't.
No,
and I'm grateful that I had, you know, my own studio space to be able to record this stuff and get my head around it. It was quite a long, involved process. But I've done a few things with Richard over the years. We did the soundtrack to Tomb Raider, and that was an 80-piece orchestra. And this was all sort of written out exactly. And unfortunately, they had various soloists. It's Nigel Hitchcock, great alto player, was one of the soloists. Lawrence Cottle played bass on it, and this was all written out exactly again. But thankfully, I didn't play with the orchestra. I had the opportunity to record everything independently. Otherwise, that would have been pretty scary stuff.
Yeah. So you know, if it's clicked up, I guess that's doesn't really matter. Doesn't make any difference, does it? You know, it's going to be the same.
Yeah. So I've sort of got a track. What I was going to say with Richard, when he arranges the music, he puts everything onto like a MIDI track, and I really sort of, if you're going to record drums separately, I really think the drums have to go onto the music first, because my analogy is it's a little bit like the my emails are pinging in the background. It's a little bit like
a gig come in.
yeah. So it's a little bit like the drums are the skeleton for the music. So if it's sort of contemporary music, the drums are the skeleton. Then you can lock everything to the drums. You know, but ideally, it's nice if the drums can be a complete performance rather than just moving everything onto the grid. And if you get the right guys, you know, they can also complement what you're doing and make it sound really nice without having to, again, sort of edit stuff too much.
Sure.
But certainly the drums going down first, I think, is a good thing. And Richard really is a big fan of that and really sort of insists that that's the way it's done.
I mean, it's a no-brainer, really, isn't it? If you're comfortable and solid on the click, as I'm 100% sure that you are, and you know that the drums are grooving, surely that's easier for everybody else to lay their parts, especially a bass player. You know, they're going to want to hear the bass. I know the bass player will have a part written out, but he'll still want to hear that bass drum and lock in with it, won't he?
Yeah. It's kind of a different way of recording now as well, isn't it? And I saw a thing on, and you're absolutely right, and I saw a thread on Facebook, and they were talking about it was an old album with an old album. It still seems like last year, but it was a Chick Corea Electric Band album called Inside Out, which was amazing. And Dave Weckl, I know he was saying that was probably the most challenging. Well, I understand through secondhand information, but basically the gist of it was a really tough session because that was just pre-editing everything, so everything was recorded live. And it was really challenging. I understand that the great Chick Corea was actually arranging the music on the session the night before. So just finishing it all there and then. But to play all of that stuff live, you know, is a different world. You know, go back further to some of my heroes, the great, you know, Jeff Porcaro, the Michael McDonald album. I love the first one with I Keep Forgetting on there. And it's got Steve Gadd and it's got Jeff Porcaro. And there's slight things in there where maybe it doesn't quite, it has gone to the wrong part, but it all sounds live. You know, there's little, actually, I feel like I'm being a bit harsh there, not gone to the wrong part, but there's like little bits that are slightly imperfect.
Yeah.
But it's great because it's like it's handmade. It's not
Real.
digitally made. It's real. Yeah, and it's a real connection. So recording drums along with a MIDI track is great. It's a good compromise. And if you can put the drums down first, I think that's really good, particularly if it's sort of if it's a good performance as opposed to lots of drop-ins or moved onto the grid. But then I don't think anything beats having a band that's well rehearsed, knowing exactly what they're doing in a room together, recording this stuff,
No.
in an old school way, like the Chick Corea album or the Michael McDonald album. That real sort of 5 musicians together, just playing and being able to spontaneously feel, the same thing.
Well, as silly as it sounds, that's making music, isn't it? It's a simple fact.
Yeah, exactly that. You
It's
could, yeah. I couldn't have said it better. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly that,
yeah,
precisely.
five or six guys in a room playing. It should be that simple. I know it's not always, and especially people different sides of the world recording together these days, which is it's a great thing to have. But it's also a shame that it's not more of people in the same room. I think it's a novelty these days to be in the same room as another musician, isn't it?
Well, that's a really nice segue, because you were saying what else have I been doing this year? So just 2 weeks ago, I went to Rack Studios in St John's Wood in London and played on a recording which is actually going to be filmed for Rack Studios. And some of the great session players that have played there, I don't include myself in that, but I do include a couple of the guys that are on a session. And it was Ray Russell, the guitarist, who I work with a lot, and Ray's played with everybody. And I guess the drummers maybe who are watching this will maybe have seen Ray as the guitarist on Simon Phillips's instructional DVD with the great Anthony Jackson on bass. So Ray, and there was Mo Foster on bass, who's an absolute legend, and there was Johnny Thurkel on trumpet. There's my pal, but Johnny is one of the most recorded trumpet players in this country ever. It's fantastic. You just look at his Wikipedia page. Say no more. Simon Williscroft.
Just a little side note about Johnny Thurkel. I really enjoyed the live stream you did with Johnny as your guest. I thought it was fabulous.
He's brilliant. He's got so many great quotes. Yeah,
Great.
yeah. A couple of them just come to mind now. But say Simon Williscroft on tenor saxophone, who does the Duran Duran gig, and Jim Watson on piano. But we're all in the same on Rose electric piano. We're all in the same room playing together, playing Ray's music, and it's part of it's a thing for what's known as the National Archive, and so it will get broadcast. It was all filmed. And we just recorded 3 tracks together, 2 of Ray's, and one was Stratus, the Billy Cobham track, which was great. Yeah, so that was recorded. So I'm looking forward to that coming out and sort of seeing the light of day. But you were talking about Johnny, and it was interesting because we were talking about doing sessions for people, which is sort of a different. In some ways, there's a different way of doing it these days, in as much as you can do it remotely, or there's sort of editing that takes place. And as you said, it's not always musicians together in the same room. But I said to Johnny, if you don't like the music, we were talking about, you could get called for a session. Would you accept? These days, sessions are becoming few and far between. It's not like it used to be. It's a different world, and I think everyone accepts that. But Johnny was saying that it doesn't matter what the music is, you can always do a great job. And Johnny started off playing with Gil Evans, and he went to play with the Buddy Rich big band and toured with Buddy Rich. Wow. And then ended up playing, with Jamiroquai, Lisa Stansfield, via a whole list of other people, the Spice Girls. Basically, I think it was, if there was trumpet on a track between the years of 1985 to 2005, and it made it into the charts, it would have been John, most likely, on trumpet. He played on 25 #1 singles and 38 top 10 albums. So yeah, pretty serious stuff. But such a lovely guy. So we were talking about, I'm really fortunate. I don't class myself at all. I'm certainly not in that league. I'm just happy to be hanging on to their coat shirt tails and get the occasional call. But Johnny said something about working with other musicians. He said it doesn't matter what the music is. If you're in the session world, you can always do a good job. And I don't know if you remember on the live stream, he said that great quote. He said, yeah, it's a bit like, imagine someone's pushing a pram down the high street, and you look in, and it's that music is somebody's baby.
Yeah.
So if you're on a session with someone, you're not likely to stick your head into the pram and say, "Oh, that's an ugly baby." You're not likely to say that, are you? In the same way, you can always do a great job with the music. That really made me laugh when John said that. I'm not quite sure if
Well, there's a lot of truth, isn't it? If somebody's paying, you want to do, if your name's going on the credit, you want to do a good job anyway, don't you?
Yeah, you're going to be polite. You're not going to say, "I don't like your music. It's a load of rubbish." You're going to do your
Yeah.
best job. It doesn't really matter what it is. And actually, I'm a big believer in that. It doesn't matter what the music is. You can always do a good job.
Yeah.
And Dom Famularo's great quote: "What's the worst that's going to happen? You're going to learn something." So
Yeah. Well, he's full of great quotes, and
yeah,
well, hey, look, let's talk about Dom just for a second because it's no secret, and you don't hide the fact that you still have lessons from guys regularly, which I love. You
always, always.
know,
I'm open about everything.
yeah, and I know Dom is a good friend of yours, and we know what a
Mm,
great guy he is. I'm lucky enough to have spoken to him many times, but
mm.
he's been through the mill, and he's come through the other side, hasn't he? Which is just great news.
It's been an emotional roller coaster. So we got over COVID. There's been some other challenges in the world, and Dom's had his own fair share of challenges. So I was having a drum lesson, celebrating the fact, great, everyone's going back to work. We've got over COVID, and Dom was not his usual self, and was saying, "Yeah, well, I've got something to tell you." And it was like, "What's that?" He said, "Being diagnosed with pancreatic cancer." Now, my dad died of pancreatic cancer, so I know just how serious that is. And Kirsty and I were like really sort of, I feel tearful now, but but Don has got over it, amazing.
He's a
If
force of
anyone can
nature.
get over, yeah, well, when I say he's got over it, the term that he uses is that he's cancer free,
Yeah, 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 of course.
which is amazing. So we're going to go and see Don. We're going to go over there in June and just go and see him for a couple of days, which will be great. But Don is is a fantastic drummer. He's a fantastic educator. He's one of the greatest inspirational minds I think the drumming industry has had.
Yeah.
But just a lot of love for everybody. He's got a whole host of and when you say that I take lessons off Dom. Well, if I take lessons off Dom, I studied years ago with a great drummer called Joe Morello,
Hmm.
and I love the history of the instrument. And Joe was a student of George Lawrence Stone, who wrote some great books. I've got one of my music stand here, such as this one, Access to Rebounds and Stick Control.
That's a nice
But
shiny
Dom,
copy, by the way.
yeah.
That's not the
This is about
first of those, is it? That's not the
this
first
is
one.
about the third or fourth copy that I've had. Yeah, I mean, you can even see in here. I don't know if you can see the writing in pencil there.
Yes.
Don Lefton, there's a date on there. So we've been going through some of this stuff. So I studied with Joe Morello, who was a student of George Lawrence Stone. I studied with Don, but Don has studied with Jim Chapin, who, of course, he was a student of the great Sanford Moeller. And then there was Al Miller, who was another great teacher that Dom had studied with, who was also one of Sanford Moeller's students. I don't know so much about Al Miller, but I certainly know a lot about Jim Chapin, and I know a lot about Joe Morello. And these are the guys who started this whole thing. So I find it fascinating through studying with Dom, the way you can trace, and I love the history of the instrument, and trust me, drums didn't start with Dennis Chambers. We didn't start just there. But if you trace it back, I always talk about I don't know, maybe people will disagree with me, but this is my own personal opinion. But for me, there's 5 game-changing drummers, really, when I look at it, in my opinion. And maybe I'm being a bit outspoken with this, but it just kind of helps me to kind of my simple mind compartmentalize things. So we had Gene Krupa, but then as a further derivative, of course, we had Buddy Rich, who offered one thing. Fast forward a few years, and Buddy started to have challenges because with his big band playing gigs, because there was, I think it was it February the 3rd, 1964, at the Ed Sullivan Show, something happened. And what's fascinating is that a lot of the great drummers and other musicians. Steve Lukather, I was listening to his audiobook of The Gospel According to Luke,
Yeah.
and he said a game-changing moment for him was the Beatles when they played on the Ed Sullivan Show. Greg Bissonette says the same. I think Jeff Porcaro, the Porcaro family, so it was Mike Porcaro, Jeff Porcaro, and Steve Porcaro, all watched that game. There's another Vinnie Colaiuta, another person who watched that. Big game-changing moment. And people, I've heard people say, so what is it with Ringo Starr then? He just bashes about on the drums and doesn't really do anything like Buddy did technically. Yeah, but I tell you what was big about Ringo, in my opinion, is that he was the very first drummer, singer-songwriter drummer, the drummer that actually constructed drum parts into a commercial pop song, if you like. So then you fast forward, and then who else was game-changing? Well, there's one other one then called, and this was a jazz person, and he's playing blah 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 blah, and behind Miles Davis at the age of 17, the Miles Davis Quintet, which actually, sorry, I should rewind, was just before the Beatles, so he should have come second. But Tony Williams, amazing, and he was a game changer for me. Another person who brought something else in. Then fast forward, who was a derivative then of that, who had two bass drums and started to play sort of left-hand lead things, was Billy Cobham. I really think he was a game changer. The game, playing sort of the ability to play all things with different hands, different feet, two bass drums, and
influencing Simon Phillips a lot as well with that.
Simon Phillips, absolutely, and Gary Husband, another one influenced by him. You can see things, but who influenced Billy Cobham? Go back a little bit. Tony Williams. You can hear a lot of Tony Williams in there. Listen to Vinnie Colaiuta. If you were to take Tony Williams and put him on a grid and clean everything up, there would be elements of Vinnie Colaiuta in there. And I'm fascinated with this lineage. So then fast forward, and I said the drums didn't start. This is my summation of it, my sort of simple mind. But I think it's fascinating when you look at it, and if it inspires someone to to consider this, and actually inspires people to look further back, then I guess that's probably a good thing. So then Billy Cobham influenced someone else who came along, who I said drums didn't start with, Dennis Chambers. But there's an awful lot of Billy Cobham. I mean, Dennis Chambers is playing in a different way. So then we look at another drummer then, who I mentioned very often, who had a certain sound, and that drummer is Steve Gadd. Really the first proper designer label, not session drummer, the first designer label session musician. Where it actually became fashionable to have this, not fashionable, but it became a thing. If you had this person's name, whether it was Michael Brecker, whether it was Don Grolnick or Steve Gadd on your record, then it was, or Bernard Purdy, these people in a certain area of music, it became a thing. And, which is great. So the first sort of designer label session drummer, Steve Gadd, and I find all this fascinating to see where it came from. And then of course the other drummers came from that, Dave Weckl, and then fast forward right up to today. So it almost feels as if it's gone into, I'm going on a bit of a ramble here.
It's
so
fine.
You've got these different branches, but it sort of starts off with the jazz, to the pop, to the funk, to the fusion, to all the different elements. And before you know it, now we have so many different ways of listening to music, largely YouTube. So during the pandemic, I had the opportunity to, we've spoken about my passion, kind of tracking people down and trying to, get information from different people. Well, Dom put me in touch with David Garibaldi. And David is a really fascinating person and quite a challenging person to study with. He's quite an intellectual, so he'll challenge you with asking certain things about your playing, but he's got a very certain view. And I thought, I got something pretty major from him. And I tell you what it was. He was saying that actually it was a lot easier back in the 70s to be creative. And so, well, how do you work that out? Because there's not so many, we didn't have YouTube, we didn't have Spotify and Apple Music and Tidal and everything else. He said, well, that's precisely why it was easier to be creative. Why was that? He said because he would listen to maybe like James Brown, J.B. Starks, or he'd listen to maybe some of the early Steely Dan recordings, or he'd listen to Bernard Purdie or whoever, Jim Gordon. Maybe Jim Gordon was a bit afterwards, but he would listen to all these great, or Tony Williams and Philly Joe Jones, and you couldn't see these people playing, so you had no idea what the drum set looked like. So you couldn't set up your drums exactly like we do today. I really like Benny Greb, so therefore I'm going to have my little 10-inch tom just a bit low, just on the bass drum. I'm going to do this to my floor tom, and straight away, well, it's kind of there on a plate for you. There's no thinking involved with it. There's no creativity particularly. All you do is just mimicking somebody else, and I think it has its place, absolutely, and it's a good way of learning. But for those guys, when they just had vinyl, they would put this stuff on, and David Garibaldi said to me, he said, well, yeah, I couldn't really kind of sometimes work out exactly what they were doing, so I'd do a close approximation of it, and it would become what he does today. And the other thing that David does, he said, he's got a very good quote, which was a Mark Twain quote, and he said, whatever you do, don't let school get in the way of your education. I said,
isn't that a great quote? That,
yeah,
I like that.
He said, put these books away. Start thinking about what you're doing. I said, well, you're an innovator. You started off with the linear funk stuff. He said, well, hang on. No, there are other people involved with that as well, and that evolved a different way, actually, but maybe not the way you think. He said that didn't evolve because I suddenly got out of bed one day and thought, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start playing linear funk. No, of course it didn't. That evolved, like we all evolve in different ways. But Mike Clark, Herbie Hancock, and I was really blessed to be able to play at one of the last London drum shows, do a double drum thing with Mike Clark, and we played Actual Proof. And I was saying, well, he's and Mike Clark, for those that have seen him, he's a bit like he always kind of reminds me of like a mafia dude or something, but he's such a lovely person. He's a real softie, but he kind of sounds like he could be pretty hardcore. And he was saying, yeah, I'm a jazz cat, this is what I do. I play spring, ding, ding, ding. And I got a phone call from Herbie Hancock asking me to play on the record, which of course then I think that record became Thrust, which had Butterfly and Actual Proof and all of that stuff. It was Butterfly. And anyway, he was saying, well, but it wasn't a jazz album. It was a straight eighth funk album.
Yeah.
And I think if I've got it correct, and I'm sure you'd correct me if not, but basically it was that whole linear thing was a jazz groove, or the album was a jazz groove just straightened out. And
right, okay,
yeah, which was one of the ways that sort of evolved. And this was the gospel according to David. So those guys now, I think they're called the Stick People, and they've got this. They do a podcast and speak to different people.
I've seen it. Yeah,
Gregor Rico.
Yep.
There's Mike Clark. There's David. And what was quite interesting, he said, yeah, we used to, we were part of the San Francisco funk scene, so it was a really healthy scene. There was all the clubs happening there, and he said, but remember, and this is a really good tip for today, very uncool to copy each other. That was like the biggest disrespect.
Yeah.
We didn't copy each other. We did our own thing. We had our own take on it. So yes, we would take certain things, but importantly, he said, we'd make it our own. And I thought that was interesting because today I struggle sometimes to, I can see exactly the influences. And I think, we need more originality, I think. In some ways, there are a lot of guys out there who are doing original things. Of course, there are, fantastic, but everyone seems to jump on the bandwagon, and then all of a sudden that becomes a thing, and all of a sudden everyone's using, the same drum set layout, the same cymbals, the same Gretsch drums or whatever, and all of a sudden,
yeah, it's nice to see somebody like Mikey Sorbello, for example. His set is totally. Well, put it one way, I wouldn't want to kit share with him. Have you seen the way he sets his drum?
I know. But then it's like Daru Jones. There's a similar sort of thing.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, but both wonderful players. But it's nice to see something different, isn't it? You know, and as you say,
Well, you study with David Garibaldi, and that's what it's all about. Is
yeah,
being yourself.
yeah,
It's creating your identifiable sound.
yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah.
But I mean, obviously, we're going a little way back here when you studied with Joe Morello. Tell us a little bit about that, Ian, because that fascinates me. I mean, the name Joe Morello, it's one of those legendary names, isn't it? And the fact that you've spent time with him I find absolutely remarkable.
I was that was a blessing, and that happened as a result of I've got two uncles who play drums, Carl and Steve, and Carl was a big fan of Joe and knew Joe, and he said, "Yeah, this is the guy you need to study with in order to sort your hands out." Well, my hands, I think, I'd got Malcolm, who was fantastic, Malcolm Garrett, but both Malcolm and I went to New York, to New Jersey, to West Orange to study with Joe, and he became a bit like a grandfather figure.
Mm,
Joe, bless him, he was brilliant, and this is a person who played with the Dave Brubeck Quartet. Take Five, he was the drummer on that, which was, I think, one of the last songs in what they used to call the hit parade to feature a drum solo that made it to #1.
yeah.
And he'd played for presidents and all sorts. And the thing about Joe was that he was, and the fact, do you know what? The thing about all of these guys is they're just regular people.
Mm,
And Joe is just such so funny, is so witty, and just great, just a lovely person to be around. And aside from which, he had, in my opinion, probably the finest hands out of anyone that has lived, and that includes a lot of the obvious people that we think of when we say that.
And did you take anything away from those lessons? That you'd still use today? I mean, I don't know how many you
Mm.
had, but did you
Oh
take
yeah,
something away?
absolutely. And I can share with you a couple of the principles that I had actually that I took away from Joe. And so the first principle was just being relaxed when you play, and that you're not going to play fast by being tense. So
Mhm.
everything we did with Joe was based around, it's very strict really. We started off with the first lesson. I was learning how to play four strokes, which started with the stick being held at 90 degrees,
Mm.
throwing the stick onto the head, but allowing the natural rebound of the stick to bring you back to this position. I remember the grip, talking about the grip with Joe, the fulcrum position, being here, and the different gears, which is something which Dom talks about as well. This being sort of for fine, the grip here is for fine playing, so piano and very quiet playing. Coming back to the utility grip, really, which is here. Coming back to the back of the stick, which is when you're in sort of fifth or sixth gear on the motorway and you're playing quite hard.
Interesting.
Um,
Wow.
but Joe's got a thing where he throws the stick down and allows the stick to just come back to this position. And I spent hours and hours trying to perfect that. But what I will say is today, that I do feel an avid learner. I'm fascinated by drums, and it's what I do. But I still practice now at least an hour every day,
Yeah.
maybe 6 times a week. Miss a day here and there, but and I'll go on a practice pad, come onto the practice drum set, and do all of this stuff. And the stuff that Joe showed me as a teenager at the age of 14 when I had the first lesson with Joe, which would have been 1990, was was amazing. And bearing in mind that Joe's taught so many great people. Danny Gottlieb
Yeah.
was a student, John Riley was a student of Joe's. So again, that whole lineage, and Don studied with Joe, so the lineage basically goes through several people. And I think I said that drumming didn't start with Dennis Chambers. Well, no, it didn't, because Dennis Chambers was also influenced by someone. But this is a great legacy of great drummers that have gone before. And I think it's really important. And I love, as I said, I love the history of the instrument. So I'm fascinated to study and practice this every day.
Incredible. I mean, you talked about your two uncles, obviously Steve and Carl. Were they when you were a youngster? Were they part of the reason why you took up the instrument anyway?
Exactly that. I remember a Christmas, it'd be 1986, and I was my dad wanted a VHS recording of a video recording of my uncle, my dad's middle brother, playing with Emerson, Lake and Palmer in 1977 at the Montreal Olympic Stadium,
Yeah.
which I think is one of the tours actually which cost so much money. And they had a whole symphony orchestra with them and this whole thing. But Cole played this great drum solo, and and I guess it was, sort of my playing has gone in a different direction now. But at the time, that was fantastic. Just watching Carl's energy, speed, the way he played on it, and it was all very showbiz. He had the gongs and the timpanis, and it was very much at the time. But in its own way, what I really respect about Carl, he's my uncle, but what I respect from a musical point of view is that he's his own person. He does his own thing. Yes, you can see it's a derivative of Buddy Richards, a massive influence, but he took that to the rock world.
Yeah.
Really. I mean, there were people before. There's like Mitch Mitchell and people who had great hands, but I think Carl was really the first person. And what was great was it's not a competition. This is music, which is an art form, which is purely subjective. But you could never compete with that. You'd never fill stadiums now with the name Palmer associated with as part of the name of the band.
No.
Well, it's more about the singers now, isn't it?
Yeah, of course.
The act. But those were great days, I think, and I don't kind of want to go. I don't want to go on about the past because we need to talk about the future.
Yeah, of course.
We say we don't look back. We have to look back because without having an idea of what went before, it's very difficult then to actually move the whole thing forward.
Absolutely, it's really interesting because obviously, it's quite rare to have three great drummers in the same family, isn't it? So it just fascinating.
Well, I should mention Steve as well.
Exactly. Yes, I'm including Steve in that. Yeah,
Steve's great, and Steve was the person. So Carl was the one that inspired me, and Steve was the person who really sat down and sort of helped me get started and showed me the basic. And I remember with Steve playing "I Love Rock and Roll" along to with Joan Jett and the Blackhearts, playing drums along with that at the age of 8. That track, which was great. And Steve had the patience to kind of show me and it was brilliant. So I was very fortunate. My dad was obviously knew how Carl had progressed and was really supportive. And hence the reason he took me to New York to have some lessons with Joe. But I will say none of this is for ego purposes. It's not for self-serving. It's something which I'm just fascinated with. This is it's a life's mission. It's something which I do, and something which I love.
And I think lots of people are the same. I mean, there's a great podcast out there called Drum History Podcast. I don't know whether you've ever heard it, Bart van der Zee. I mean, Bart has some amazing guests on. He's just had his 200th episode, and I've spoke to Bart many times. And it's absolutely huge, the history of drums and drumming, and the people who've been involved in it for the last however many hundreds of years. So it's a huge thing, and I think you only have to look at the amount of people who go to the vintage drum fair in Coventry, and it's packed out for 2 days. People talking about and looking at old gear and talking about drummers. It's an amazing thing. It's a great thing to be part of. It really is.
Well, and let's move it forward now. All of the great drummers. I mean, all of the drummers in London that I hold in great esteem. Neil Wilkinson, Ian Thomas, Mike Bradley, and Mike Smith. Loads of great players. The late great Chris Dagley, Jeremy Stacey, or Mark Mondesi, Gary Husband. All of these great drummers. They're great drummers, and they always will be great drummers. But they're not the new guys coming through now. No. These are the guys who are in the middle of their careers. So, but there's so many great guys that I really enjoy this. Benny Greb, he's not such a new guy now, but when he came into the scene, I really loved what he was doing. But then Jamie Murray, see him on, and some of the Instagram people now, Justin Scott, and Now, I tell you who's playing I really appreciate and really love is, and I'm a huge fan of his playing, is Carter McLean.
Oh, yes,
And
wonderful.
I love what he does. And the reason I love it is because it's music, and he's a guy that's done his homework and he
Yeah.
understands the history of the instrument. And and I've noticed on his Instagram page, I don't know him, I'd love to get to know him. It's fantastic, a real inspiration. But he puts on the odd clip here of Billy Joe and Tony Williams, and you know that he knows the history of the instrument, which enables him to do what he does now and move the instrument forward. And I find that fascinating.
Yeah, and he gets some beautiful drum sounds as well, doesn't he?
Oh, really? And he's into the recording side. So,
Yeah,
as we know, it's not enough these days just to be into the drums. We need to know how to record these things. We need to know, and as a musician, we need to know how to present ourselves to get our name out there. There was a quote from Vinny Caliuta years ago, and he said something really interesting. He said, "Yeah, the problem with social media these days is that there's so much noise, no one can hear anything."
how true.
So what do you do to get cut through that barrage of noise?
Yeah, yeah.
It's open season.
I don't know, is it a good thing or a bad thing? I personally think it's a good thing. It's
It's a great thing. It's a great thing. We have to embrace. I think we have to embrace it.
mm,
Absolutely. I know some of the older drummers say, "Oh, no, I don't do social media. I don't do all this." Fine, but at least we accept that it's another outlet. It's another way of furthering the art form of drumming,
mm,
which in its own way is a very small component of furthering the art form of music,
of course.
which heaven knows needs some help at the moment. So,
Yeah, really
mm,
does. But
mm,
obviously, drumming aside, most people who know you or follow you on social media, you have an incredible other side to your career. Yeah, it is your career. You're a pilot of a very high regard, shall we say?
yeah. So I'm what they call a training captain
Yeah,
for Virgin Atlantic
yeah.
Airways. So Richard Branson, the person who started that airline in 1984, and my mum said I always say it's a hobby that's gotten out of control because in 1999 I took my first flying lesson in a light aircraft, and I was just fascinated to do this. And I've got a friend who is a bass player but was also an airline pilot for
Yeah,
Virgin,
yeah.
and he used to play bass on cruise ships with my uncle Steve, because Steve used to
Wow.
play on
Okay.
these cruise ships. And he came to Ronnie Scott's, and I was playing there, and I was saying, "Oh, finding it really hard. I just don't know where my career is going with music, and I really love flying airplanes, and I'm really glad you come along." I was sort of asking, and what's funny is actually I've got loads of friends who are musicians who love talking about aeroplanes. So get together with musicians, they want to talk about aeroplanes. Get together with pilots, and they want to talk about music, which is great. I guess we're never satisfied. But no, I love. No, I love the flying side of my life, the science, but I always call it the science of drumming and the art of flying. So,
Well, yeah, but and it fascinates me how you combine the two. Obviously, you're doing lots of studio work at the moment. And how do you kind of tie that in with the flying? Because obviously, I guess when you've got to go and do some pilot work, you've got to go.
mm.
And is it a difficult book to keep, if you like?
No, my mum said because of the restrictions, I mean, it's getting harder and we have to fly more, certainly post pandemic. So it is getting more challenging, that's true. But I'm also getting older and more discerning with what I want to do musically. So actually, the two things do tie in. But my late mum said something early on when I got my first flying job. She said, "Ian, this is the best part-time job you'll ever have." And I was full-time,
Yeah.
and she was right. And so I'm blessed that I've been able to work hard in that area. I don't have kids, and which would be something which I guess is a trade-off. If I had kids, I'd have a lot less time.
Mhm.
So I can be a bit nerdy and devote a lot of time to playing drums, and
You'd have a
then
lot less
devote.
money as well, can I add?
Yeah. Well, when I studied with Dom, he had a very good thing. The first lesson, he said, "Well, you do your flying bit, and you do your music." And he said, "What?" He said, "What I advise you to do," he said, "you have to divide your life into 3 areas. So 33% of a third into each area. So I devote, a third into family, so personal and social. A third of my life is flying, and a third of my life is music."
Hmm.
But sometimes those ratios can vary a little bit. So at the moment, actually, I'm going through a fairly busy phase of doing the flying side of things. Um, but it but it really is fascinating. I love it, and it keeps me mentally active. I became a captain on the those of anyone that's interested, on an Airbus A330-300 aircraft, and the A330-900 Neo. Neo stands for new engine option, which is the new all singing or dancing Airbus A330. So I flew on, took command of one of those aircraft to Tampa and back. And just last week, actually, during the descent phase of the flight into Tampa, we saw the SpaceX heavy Falcon Heavy launch. We didn't. Well, I sort of half expected it, but I didn't know we'd be there at the precise time, and that was fascinating. And I will say one thing that I know certain musicians think that, and this is my experience. So I'm not talking for everybody, but I'm very open about flying. Very open, and I share things about flying on Facebook. I share things about music on Facebook because both of them are components of what I do as a human being. But I know, people think, well, I better not write about my daytime job on social media because it means I'm less available for gigs. Well, maybe it does to a certain extent, but I find it a whole lot more depressing denying a side of your life, which clearly is common knowledge, and people know that you do. So I would try to steer clear of actually just saying, no, 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 I'm only a drummer. I don't make a living. So some people might say, you're an amateur musician then, in which case, the old school money, because my sole income is not from music. Well,
Does that
may be
mean
true.
does that mean you're an amateur pilot then if you're not flying planes all the time?
That's right. Exactly that point. Exactly that point. But there's loads of other musicians in history who have done who are pilots. Bruce Dickinson,
Yeah, exactly.
releasing with Iron Maiden. Tom Brown, the great trumpet player, funking for Jamaica.
Yes.
He was an airline pilot. Steve Morse has been a commercial pilot, the
Oh, I didn't know
guitarist,
that.
I understand. Yeah. So, John Travolta, another person that has flown. So I'm very fortunate. I count my blessings and I say, thank you, God, that I'm able to
Yeah.
do two things.
And it's not just doing two things, it's doing two things to the highest level. Would you say you've got a kind of obsessive personality when it comes to doing something? You go in
Yeah.
deep all the way.
Yes. Yeah. Without going into too much detail about it, but I'm sure everyone will understand what I'm talking about. I gave up alcohol 10 years ago, and a component of people that have an issue with this is the personality side. The drinking is a symptom of the illness, and I'm really open about talking about this as well because it's out in the open anyway.
Yeah, sure.
And so I don't drink alcohol. Certainly don't do anything else. My addiction is Starbucks coffee, and that's pretty much it, really. Trying to get that. But part of that personality that led me to doing that sort of stuff was the same personality that means that I have this real sort of hunger to this sort of compulsiveness. So nothing can be done in half measures. The drinking wasn't done in half measures. The drumming isn't done in half measures, and the flying isn't done in half measures, which I have to be careful of as well, because that in itself can become mentally difficult, challenging occasionally. So you have to keep a tight rein on it. So it's not everything in the garden is rosy. In order to do anything to a good level, there's not so much sacrifices because I choose to do it, but it's a hell of a lot of hard. It is hard work, and it's a compulsion. It is. It's an OCD. It's a compulsion. There's various sort of mental things going on that I think drive people to do that.
But every credit to you. You've taken both both careers to the highest level. And you might disagree, but you really, I mean, I've heard you play firsthand many times. I got you up to do a clinic. Gosh, that was, I
That was
don't
great.
think that was, believe it or not, nearly 5 years ago now, or maybe 6 years. I don't know.
That's when
But
we first met. Yeah.
yeah, and you know, your playing is, well, it's phenomenal. And everyone who's ever heard you will say the same.
Well,
But the fact that you've taken both things, and I think it's a really cool thing to be able to do both. You
yeah.
know, yeah, amazing.
Well, I'm blessed and fortunate to be able to do both, but I'm fortunate. I think talent. I'm not so sure how I feel about the word talent. Certain people are predisposed to have more time to be able to devote to things to get to a high level. You know, Buddy Rich said that he never practiced. He never practiced, but he played They played 270 plus nights of the week, and every time he took a massive drum solo,
Yeah,
and
that's going to help.
playing full on with a band. And of course, he practiced. And Joe Morello would say, "I said, so is it true that Buddy Rich never practiced?" And he was saying, "No." No, so I'm not so sure. This whole thing. Yeah, I'm blessed that I've got the time to. I really appreciate what you say. I know I feel like I've come a long way, but I feel like I've got a long way to go.
Yeah, and you're not
So
afraid. You're not afraid to make changes as well, and fairly drastic ones. Because I remember you were always a traditional grip player, and all of a sudden, it's like, oh no, it's match grip now. I don't play traditional anymore, and it's
that's
like,
right.
and it's literally. I mean, that not only changes the way you play, but obviously the way you set your drums as well. It's it's
Well, it does. It does, and this was a big thing.
yeah.
And I had a conversation with not name dropping. I had a conversation with Neil Wilkinson about this, and Neil and I were on the telephone. And I was saying about, I keep playing match grip, and now I keep playing traditional grip, and I don't play it very well, really. And I kind of play match grip when the pressure's on. And Neil said an interesting thing to me. He said, "Well, you need to think of it like this: if you're doing prime time Saturday night TV session, a CV session, and the red light is on, and you got to perform, what grip would you play?" Yeah, I play match grip. Right, so you're a match grip player. Yeah, and you're messing about with. If you're a tennis player, and Neil's son is a great tennis player, if you're playing tennis, would you play? Would you suddenly in the final of Wimbledon start playing a double-handed backhand if you're a single-handed backhand player normally? Of course you wouldn't. So why are you messing about playing traditional grip? Oh,
Wow.
okay, that was good. But then Thomas Lang was a match grip. That's a traditional grip player. He's gone to match grip.
Yeah.
And Dom Famularo was a big factor in me just embracing the match grip. And the reason is because he said, well, drumming in the 21st century is becoming more of a symmetrical thing. Dom now plays left-hand lead for a rock group. He plays left-hand lead on the rise cymbal, plays right-hand lead. And I was saying, well, people say to me, and I said to Dom, well, I can play more sensitively when I'm playing in a jazz trio by using this grip, by playing my very poor traditional grip. Because I just, get up on the tips and all of this, as Dave Brecker would say. And he said, that's interesting. So why don't you play traditional grip with your right hand then? Oh, I never have played traditional grip with my right hand. I said, well, do you have problems playing sensitively and quietly with your right hand? Not at all. Oh, you can do it with your left hand then. There you go. And it's interesting when you look at it. So I think that there is a place for it. And, I'm not saying I wouldn't play traditional grip. Right. And I think of the grips like a paintbrush. So we said about this grip here at the front, the fulcrum for the fine movements. That's like my fine paintbrush. Then I've got my medium paintbrush. I've got my thick paintbrush, which all develop a different sound on the instrument. And then, I've got my special brush, which I could use. But you can see it like you can treat it like that. But I think there's definitely a move towards drummers playing match grip now. Yes. Steve Smith wrote a whole book on playing different versions of match grip. Whether it's a German timpani, French timpani, American timpani, or French timpani. So I think that's something which fascinates me. I've changed my drum set. So you've seen my drum set do 360 degrees because I went through using the 1 rack tom, the 12-inch rack tom, the 2 floor toms to 12 and 14. we moved house recently, and I've actually, it's not really a coincidence, but I sat on the drums and I've gone back to using the 10, 12, 14, and 16, or 10,
Oh,
12, and
okay.
14s. So the rack tom's back again to the original setup that I used 5 years ago when I came up to Honeywell.
Fantastic. Oh, that's good. That's good. Well, look, mate, this has been absolutely fantastic, and I've really enjoyed it. And it's nice to get some, every one of these I do is very different. People like to talk maybe about records they've played on, people they've played with, but it's nice to get people's views on, on this craft. That well, it's a craft when you and the other guys do it. Maybe not when I do it. But this thing we do, and it's nice to get opinions and thoughts, and it's nice to hear them. So thank
I
you so
think
much
it's
for doing it.
I know, my pleasure, mate. And I'm just going to say, I know that we all have our opinions, and what I will say is that hopefully it's not taken that I'm being really opinionated. But hopefully I mean it out of enthusiasm
Mm,
and love for what I do. So and it's just, all my opinions are entirely my own,
of course.
and it's just to share the love and the passion for the instruments.
Well, anybody who's ever met you or seen you on the on your live streams will know the enthusiasm and love you have for this instrument. So
Yeah,
yeah, hey,
yeah.
everyone's entitled to their opinions, and if anyone's got a problem with it, then hey, tough luck.
They could speak to you about
Yeah,
it.
yeah, just switch off. It's fine. Not bothered.
Yeah. Oh, it's great to see you, mate, and
You
thank you
too.
so much for asking me.
It's a
And keep
pleasure.
doing what you're doing. It's great.
I
Thank
shall
you.
do. Thanks a lot, mate. See you soon. Take care.
Cheers, buddy.
Bye bye.
See you
Bye bye.
later.